What is the dark legacy of World War II? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to this week's Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you all the principled case for the libertarian philosophy. I'm joined, as I am most weeks, by Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
Good to see you, and you look very rustic and outdoorish. In
I've got
fact,
a little bit different backdrop here. I'm on vacation, but it's a working vacation, and so
I thought you had become homeless and you're sort of sitting outside the entrance of some retail store or something. Okay.
no, just doing the relax mode right now, taking life easy, taking a week off, break. But like I say, working vacation, getting a lot done, and at the same time having a good time resting and relaxing. And so we're going to do Libertarian Angle from a little bit different perspective. All right, so Richard, we recently experienced Memorial Day, and I think it's important to do something that we have periodically done over the years, and that is to address the real shibboleth of the interventionist movement, and that is World War II. It's interesting that when you and I first were starting FFF, you were vice president of academic affairs. I was the president and founder. And one of the first books we published was the Failure of America's Foreign Wars.
Yes.
Where we had chapters on World War II. And at that time, 34 years ago, there were obviously plenty of World War II veterans still around. And they certainly didn't like us questioning the holy grail of interventionism, which is World War II. But what's interesting now is that 34 years later, I would say the number of World War II veterans is probably like a handful at this point. It's very rare to find them. And so, most of the people now are veterans of the Korean War or mostly Vietnam War. And then, of course, you got a lot of young people, but they're still hearing the same nonsense from the statists and the mainstream press who have carried the official narrative forward about the sanctity, the sacredness of World War II. Because when we point out the failures of foreign interventionism, we can point out any number of examples, sacrificing people in World War I and the Korean War, and 58,000 of yours and my generation in the Vietnam War, Afghanistan, Iraq. I mean, it's just a long list of failures and death and destruction. Martin Luther King called this the greatest purveyor of violence in the world, and it really is, and it has been, it continues to be. But the interventionists could always say, wait a minute, World War II, the good war, the greatest generation, it defeated Hitler, and it shows you the triumph of American democracy over evil. But there's problems with that official scenario. For one thing, if you go back to World War I really set the stage for World War II, and that was a war in which the government was claiming that we're going to make the world safe for democracy with this particular war, and it's going to end all foreign wars, and all the wars in Europe. This will be the war to end all wars. And of course, all that American interventionism did is set the stage for World War II, for the rise of Hitler, with the Treaty of Versailles and the vicious peace that was established there. And then we've got, leading up to World War II, we've talked about what Roosevelt did to provoke the Japanese into attacking. So we don't need to delve into that. We've delved into that in previous episodes of Libertarian Angle. But what I'd like to examine today is that really the consequences of World War II, because the focus is always on that we defeated Hitler, that Hitler was going to cross the ocean and take over South America and land in the Western Hemisphere and ultimately make its way up to the United States, and the Nazi armies were going to conquer the United States, and everyone was going to start speaking German in America's public schools, which was kind of nonsensical given that Germany couldn't even cross the English Channel to conquer England. But one of the most important things about this was that here England had declared war on Germany in the first place to supposedly free Poland from Nazi tyranny. That was the goal. I mean, remember, it was England that declared war on Germany, not the other way around. And the idea is we're gonna free the Poles from this Nazi tyranny, which at the end of the war they did. But what they ignore in this whole scenario was that Poland and Czechoslovakia and the rest of Eastern Europe and East Germany was under communist control. And it was all sort of like, we won. This is a collective victory. What they ignore is that they had partnered with this evil regime known as the Soviet Union to accomplish this. And at the end of the war, Poland ends up with 45 years, and Czechoslovakia and the rest of under communist rule, which under their perspectives and under any rational perspective is not much of a victory. That's why every time the U.S. would celebrate the World War II victory, the Poles and the Czechs and the Eastern Europeans would never celebrate because they didn't see it as any great victory, because all you did was substitute Nazi control over Eastern Europe for communist control. And then the dark irony of this is that they immediately turned their partner and ally in this endeavor, the Soviet Union, into the new official enemy of the United States, which they used to justify the conversion of the United States to a national security state, which is a totalitarian form of governmental structure. They said, well, in order to defeat this new official enemy, which had been our partner and ally, we need to be like them. We need to have their same dark side powers of state-sponsored assassinations, coups, torture, kidnappings, and the whole military-industrial complex. We had to convert the whole government to a national security state. And then, of course, that results in the destruction of American liberty. You got the NSA that comes into existence in 1952, mass secret surveillance on the American people. I mean, everything changes for us. We become a garrison state as a result of World War II. Not to mention the fact we get the whole Cold War, we get the hot wars, Korea, Vietnam, and then the war on terrorism, and we're to where we are today. So this, to me, Richard, is an extremely dark legacy of the very intervention that they hold up as their model. What do you think?
Well, I think that's what's important to emphasize as well, is that the serious precedents that the events leading up to America's participation in World War II, and then the way the U.S. undertook its diplomacy during the war, set the stage of a certain Washington and executive mentality that resulted in many, if not most, of the points that you brought out. First of all, the United States had signed, the Congress had passed, and the president had signed a variety of neutrality acts in the 1930s. That if war broke out in a place such as Europe, the United States was not going to re-enter the war and was going to remain a neutral. And that was signed by FDR. But then when FDR's views of the British and the Germans were changing with the beginning of the war in Europe, what does what does Roosevelt immediately do? He starts undertaking an unofficial alliance with the British government through a very close personal relationship with Winston Churchill, a sort of executive to executive personalized diplomacy, not just avoiding and evading the US Congress under the Constitution in these matters, but hiding it from the general public. Oh, they signed the Four Freedoms Agreement, but this was sort of like just two countries with common values. There was no awareness that the United States was undertaking promises of a military alliance with the British Empire long before the attack on Pearl Harbor, but with the war in Europe going on already. There was the fact that the president took a cavalier approach towards foreign assassinations. In the midst of the Second World War, General Stilwell, who was Roosevelt's sort of liaison military officer with the Chinese government, Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government fighting the Japanese, Stilwell was constantly complaining about what he called the peanut, Chiang Kai-shek. And finally, Roosevelt told Stilwell, Well, if you can't get him to work with you the way you want, um, maybe something should be done to take care of him. And Stilwell correctly interpreted that as kill him. That is the assassination of a foreign leader. And in fact, a military plan of assassination was undertaken, in which during a state visit, when Chiang Kai-shek and Madam Chiang would be traveling from China across the Himalayas to India, the plane would have engine failure and everyone would have to bail out with parachutes. And it was planned to give Chiang Kai-shek and Madam Chiang faulty parachutes so they would die in the Himalayas. There's all in the records. And at the last minute, before the plan was actually to be executed, Roosevelt just changed his mind. But we'll notice that itself is a mentality. We're going to assassinate, we're not going to assassinate. You know, it decides how I feel about the guy today. That itself is a way of viewing the arbitrariness of executive power, not just to enter into alliances and promise military participation, but to plan the assassination of a foreign leader. And then, you know, at the last minute, well, maybe we won't. But what if he had said maybe we won't? He would have actually handed off on killing the head of the Chinese government during wartime period. And then there was all the negotiations after the war, which you've alluded to, about Roosevelt met Stalin and Churchill at the Yalta Conference in February 1945, and that basically carved up Europe. Basically, Roosevelt said, you can have the Baltic republics, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. You will be recognized to have a sphere of influence in the Eastern European countries. We're carving up Germany. We'll each have our own zones. And all of the other diplomats at the Yalta Conference said that these agreements could be stretched. Stalin said, oh, of course, there'll be elections in Eastern Europe and these countries. But everybody knew that he was doing away, as the Soviet army was advancing into these Eastern European countries in the last months of the war, to setting up stooge governments, undertaking eradication of anti-communist political and military elements that were part of the anti-Nazi underground in these countries. And Roosevelt just went along with all of this because he said, if I just give Stalin everything he wants, he'll join me in the United Nations and work for world peace. And if you read the United Nations Charter, what is the purpose of having these permanent members of the Security Council? Britain, France, the United States, China, and the Soviet Union, to be the policeman of the world. So now America enters the post-war period with the establishment of a United Nations that had the underlying premise that it was now the duty and the destiny and the responsibility of the United States to participate in a joint policing of the world. Now, as you pointed out, that a falling out soon occurred, as was viewed in Washington. The Soviets, Stalin was not going along with what America felt was the way to reconstruct Europe, a Marshall Plan for Eastern Europe as well as Western Europe. And Stalin clamped down because he viewed that as a betrayal of his promised sphere of influence. So the clampdown was even reinforced. And so now the United States, losing its wartime friend. And remember, FDR called him Uncle Joe, Uncle Joe. And I'll just repeat also an important thing. When Roosevelt came back from the Yalta Conference and was giving a report to the cabinet members, he said, and this is in the official transcripts, you know, I like Stalin more every time I meet him. But there's something of the Christian gentleman in him. Oh, yeah. The Christian gentleman who kills between 6 and 9 million peasants when they won't accept collectivized farm, when undertakes purges of those who he paranoidally views as enemies and just assassinates between 2 and 3 million other people in the second half of the 1930s, and then sends tens of millions of people to be as slave laborers in the gulags archipelago, these prison camps from one end of the Soviet Union. Yes, I can't imagine a better image of a true Christian gentleman. Thanks, FDR. But the importance of what I'm bringing out is that it changed the very way the president and the general public came to view the role of America in the world, and the latitude and liberty that the chief executive was to be viewed to have, dictatorial in many ways, is that he certain nominal controls and requirements of Congress, right? There's a certain purse string from Congress, but basically the executive decides, is an intervention needed? Where is it needed? How long should it be undertaken? What aspects should be? Indirect overthrowing of other governments, the assassination of foreign leaders, the actual deployment of American soldiers, and the undertaking of military actions that not only are focused on, quote, the enemy that you are now in combat with, but the mass collateral damage of millions of innocent civilians who get caught in the crossfire. You bring out the tens of thousands of Americans that lost their lives in the Korean War and the Vietnam War. The Korean War ending in a stalemate that goes on today, a defeat for America at the end of the day in Vietnam. But it ignores the millions of Koreans, North and South, and Vietnamese, North and South, who suffered death and destruction as a result of America choosing to participate and undertake and initiate these military conflicts. Would Ho Chi Minh have been a godsend for all Vietnamese if the U.S. had not intervened? No, because we saw what he did after he conquered, the North Vietnamese government conquered South Vietnam. And the North Korean leadership is not one that I would not want any of my sister to be engaged to or married. But it doesn't change the fact that however brutal these regimes have been or would have been, America exacerbated this, intensified it, created a degree of paranoia and cost in lives and in both the local material wealth of those societies, however meager it was compared to ours, and then the huge cost in our material wealth of men and dollars and resources that then got enveloped in this archipelago of military bases around the world. That's America's archipelago of military bases around the world, in which there's not one corner of the globe that is not in principle considered of somehow of vital interest to the United States and requiring political, economic, and military intervention, if interpreted that way by the executive branch of the US government. I'll just mention one other thing. And that is, I was recently reading an article, maybe some of the viewers and listeners might have caught this, about a recent survey of, did Americans consider it desirable for there to be introduced government surveillances within people's homes? Because there can be domestic abuse and there could be criminal activity. Think of like George Orwell, 1984, where every place has a camera that you can't escape, in principle, from them watching you 24 hours a day. Okay, those between 16 and 30 years old, 30% said they thought that would be a good idea. Black Americans, 33%. White Americans, 25%. Asians were only 12%. But the idea that it's not bad enough that the United States has this expose like Snowden did of the surveillances being undertaken by the security agencies in foreign countries and things going on home. But now for this, it has become so taken for granted that the younger generation actually says in a public opinion poll, yeah, put a camera there right in my house, be watching me 24 hours a day, because someone in my house, or maybe I might do a bad thing, and government needs to know to keep me and my family members in line. You know, all of these are sort of, in one level, logical implications and consequences of a change in the view of the role and purpose and responsibility and right of government to undertake actions foreign and domestic that in fact stifle and threaten, and then at the end of the day, destroy every facet and form and nook and cranny of any freedom that remains. And that to me is all part of the legacy of the Second World War and our participation in it.
Yeah, those are great points, especially that last point about the kind of society in which we live today is a direct consequence of what happened after World War II and as a result of the war itself. But let me go back to the pre-war era. This was a period where the American people were overwhelmingly opposed to entry into World War II. It was because they'd seen the fiasco of World War I. That here, tens of thousands of American troops had been sacrificed for nothing. I mean, it certainly was not the war to end all wars, because now you had the continuation of the war. Really, World War II was really a continuation of World War I. And the way I figure it, Richard, is if people are overwhelmingly opposed to intervention in a particular war, that will is expressed in Congress, and that will should prevail. That's what being in a representative democracy is all about. And the Constitution makes it very clear that the president cannot go to war without a declaration of war from Congress. And yet here you have a system where Roosevelt circumvents the will of the people with provoking the Japanese into attacking. It was given him what is commonly called a backdoor to war in the European conflict. And that to me is seriously wrong. When a president circumvents the will of the citizenry in a representative democracy and essentially provokes the nation into attacking the United States in order to circumvent that will, that there's something gravely wrong with that. And then in the war itself, as you're pointing out, there's this dark side of partnering with an evil regime. The communist regime in the Soviet Union, to me, it would have been no different in principle than having partnered with the Nazi regime to defeat the communist regime. Regardless, you're partnering with evil, which says a lot about the just nature of the cause in which you're embroiled. And then in the midst of the war, well, let's back up a second. Let's assume that the English had never given the Poles that guarantee. They gave them that guarantee that if the Nazis invade you, we'll come to your salvation. Well, the British knew they could never honor that guarantee. I mean, it was a fait accompli. When Germany invades Eastern Europe, Poland, Czechoslovakia, okay, we can all lament that. I mean, we can all feel sympathy for a nation that's being invaded by a brutal dictatorial regime. But it was reality that there was nothing that was going to be able to be done about this militarily. And the British had to know this, that they could never honor that guarantee. Now, let's assume that they don't invade. It's a fact of certainty that the Nazis were always going to move east against the Soviet Union. That was their mortal enemy. They considered the communist threat to be as big a threat as the U.S. ultimately saw the communist threat. There was no evidence at all that Hitler was going to move west. He considered himself a Westerner. He was going to move east. So there was going to be a war between the Soviet Union and Germany at some point. Why not let those two fight it out? Let them kill themselves. Let them destroy each other. I remember many years ago, you did a book review of a book called Icebreaker, where the author uncovered evidence that before Hitler invades the Soviet Union, he figures out that Stalin's planning on invading Germany in violation of the pact that they had entered into, and that Hitler was responding to this threat by immediately invading Germany when they were setting up all their fortifications for an attack. He caught them off guard, and Stalin was stunned that he had been double-crossed and betrayed by his partner when he in fact was planning the same kind of double-cross and betrayal. But if the United States and Great Britain and France had just let those two powers, evil powers, fight it out, whoever won was going to be tremendously weakened, because contrary to popular opinion, a war does not strengthen a nation, it weakens a nation. So whoever would have ended up as the victor would have turned out enormously weak compared to the United States and Great Britain that would have stayed out of the war. And another point I want to make about this is that in the middle of this war, Richard, The planners here in the United States were already planning for this giant shift to a national security state. And that's reflected by, they started the Pentagon in the middle of World War II. Now, anybody that looks at the Pentagon can see that this was not going to be a temporary wartime measure that was going to go out of existence at the end of the war. This was a permanent military establishment that was going to be reflected by a giant conversion to a national security state. And let me emphasize the importance of this. Our government had started out as a limited government republic. That had been our form of government for 150 years. No big, massive, permanent military intelligence establishment. No CIA, no NSA, no Pentagon, just a small, relatively basic military force. Our founding fathers hated standing military establishments, big permanent military establishments. They called them standing armies. And the reason they hated them is because they knew that that was the greatest threat to the freedom and well-being of a citizenry. Well, we get converted to a national security state. We end up becoming like the communist regimes that we abhorred by converting our government to the same type of system. State-sponsored assassinations, coups, mass secret surveillance. I mean, all the things that the communist regimes were exercising, and they used that as a justification. They said, we have to adopt their kind of system in order to defeat them because we can't be tied down by constitutional restraints. They're going to beat us. They're going to take over our country if we have to comply with these constitutional technicalities. So we end up becoming like them to oppose them. I mean, my position is you don't oppose communism and socialism by adopting their kind of governmental apparatus and their omnipotent dark side powers. You fight communism and socialism with freedom by maintaining a free society that serves as a beacon for the rest of the world. But the worst thing in the world, and then that comes up to where you're talking about the legacy of World War II, of this national security state, the wasteful lives that were lost in the Korean War, the Vietnam War, but all the way up through today, it's an all can be traced to this national security state form of governmental structure, which in my opinion should never have come into existence, but at the very minimum should have gone out of existence when the Cold War was over, when the Soviet Union dismantled. That was why the conversion took place. Why not restore America's limited government republic? And instead, they go into the Middle East, they start intervening, they start killing people in Iraq, Persian Gulf War, sanctions, killing Iraqi children. And finally, that manifests itself with the terrorist attacks on the USS Cole and East Africa, 9/11, and then we get the whole ball rolling, the invasions of Afghanistan, Iraq, the war on terrorism, and then all the destruction of American liberty here at home is reflected by Assange's revelations through WikiLeaks and Snowden's revelations about the NSA and the CIA. I mean, this is all the dark legacy of World War II.
Yeah, an element to I would suggest to understand this is that leading up to the Second World War and then in the war, the change in the Washington mentality was that the American people are ignorant, stupid, not perceiving the real interests or dangers that America faces. So Roosevelt has to lie. He goes into his unprecedented third-term election in 1940, involved in these things. His secret meetings and exchanges with Roosevelt, his plans of involving the U.S. more actively in this war under the right circumstances as he sees it. But what is he campaigning on? He kept us out of war. I hate war. I've seen war. I will never send American boys to die on foreign shores. All the time he's planning for American boys to be militarily involved in foreign shores. Now, this mentality that there has to be sort of an expert elite, foreign policy experts, strategists, those who see the wider perspective than the narrow, uninformed interests of the American citizenry. that became the legacy of the Second World War. The president intervenes in Vietnam, in Korea. Did he get a declaration of war in 1950? No. Did he get anything else than an approval for the United States to lead a UN intervention in the Korean War? Only due to the fact that, for other reasons, the Soviet representative, as a permanent member of the Security Council, was boycotting that meeting so they could get a vote through without the Soviet veto. And then to be sending those soldiers into the Korean War? No. Then the president to lie and deceive, a different president to lie and deceive about a supposed military incident between U.S. military vessels and the North Vietnamese Navy in the Gulf of Tonkin as a rationale and a justification when they knew nothing had gone on, to call upon Congress to give permission to begin an intervention that led at its height in 1965, 1966, of over 500,000 US soldiers stationed in and fighting and dying in South Vietnam. And these bombings of North Vietnam and neutral countries such as Laos and Cambodia, both of which weakened whatever remnants of non-communist forces were in those countries, to let the communist takeovers of those two nations, which culminated into the mass monstrosity of the Pol Pot communist regime that came to power in the wake of America's intervention in that part of the world, in which the Pol Pot communist regime killed 1 out of every 3 people in the entire country in a matter of less than 3 years. All of these, surely Lyndon Johnson and then Richard Nixon did not plan for, the mass murder of 1/3 of all the Cambodians. But there are unintended consequences that you set in motion that you never might imagine, but your own arrogance, your own hubris, your own presumption of knowing what's good, not just for the country, but for the world, can bring about outcomes for innocent people of untold numbers, merely because American leadership has this notion that they must play the policeman of the world, that they must stand at the ramparts, they must send military equipment and promise defenses for Taiwan and arm the Ukrainians, and all of which could lead to catastrophic, globally affecting conflicts that threaten not just the lives, but the future material well-being of billions of people. But that's what happens when, to use a phrase from Friedrich Hayek, people suffer from a pretense of knowledge of both what the situation is and what should be done, and the presumption that they should have the arbitrary power to act on it.
Yeah, and to employ Friedrich Hayek's phrase, the fatal conceit, that these people have this fatal conceit that they can manage and police the world, and there's not going to be any adverse consequences. And I think it's also important to note what they did here at home during their whole anti-communist crusade. I mean, they destroyed people's lives. Have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? I mean, there was a reign of terror across this country, and there was COINTELPRO, where they were spying on anti-war dissidents and keeping secret files on them. They were shooting people like at Kent State for opposing the war. They were spying on Martin Luther King because they were convinced that the civil rights movement was a communist front that was setting the stage for a Soviet takeover of the United States. They had regime change operations like in Iraq. In Iran, where they ousted the democratically elected prime minister of the country and set the stage for a brutal tyranny that ultimately ends up with where we are today with our hostile relations with Iran. They did the same thing with Guatemala, where they set the stage for a 30-year civil war that killed over 1 million people. The Chilean regime change operation. It just goes on, this dark legacy that exists with the conversion to a national security state to oppose what had been America's partner and ally. There's just really nothing redeeming about this whole dark legacy. And it's important that Americans, especially young people today, confront this dark legacy. Because to me, Richard, there's only one solution, and that's to restore a limited government republic this thing just keeps going on and on and on. And the root cause is the national security state. That if you get rid of the national security state and you end the foreign interventionism and the empire and the militarism, now you're talking about a giant step toward a free, prosperous, and harmonious society. So we're out of time, Richard. So on that note, we'll wrap things up. And if you're new to FFF, come and visit us at fff.org for 34 years of principal arguments, including our great book, timeless book, The Failure of America's Foreign Wars. Richard, look forward to talking to you next week.
Until next time.